Chosen one, pause for a moment. If these words have found you, it's not by chance, it's a divine summons. Heaven doesn't waste moments, and neither should you. What you're about to hear isn't just encouragement, it's revelation. This isn't a message for everyone. It's for those marked, those weary, those who've wondered why the darkness keeps circling back. If you've felt the weight of invisible battles, if you've seen the same spiritual attacks return with new disguises, this message is your turning point. Have you noticed how certain patterns repeat themselves no matter how much you pray, fast, or try to move forward? The same emotional storms, the same relationships that leave you hollow, the same temptations are knocking just when you thought you were past it. These aren't coincidences, they're cycles, and they're spiritual in nature. But here's the truth most won't say. You were never meant to survive the cycle. You were born to break it. In The Horse and His Boy, C.S. Lewis writes, "I was the lion. I was the lion who forced you to join with Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion you do not remember." And so it is with the spirit. What you thought was abandonment was often disguised protection. What you thought was random pain was actually strategic preparation. You didn't walk through the fire alone. Heaven was walking beside you, cloaked in silence, sharpening your senses for this very moment. The enemy fears one thing above all, not your tears, but your clarity. Because once you recognize that the pattern you're trapped in was never natural but assigned, you begin to move differently. You begin to pray like someone who remembers who they are. You stop coping and start confronting, and that shift terrifies hell. This isn't just another video to make you feel good for 5 minutes. This is a mirror to your soul. This is where the repeating ends, if you're ready to see why it started. Because what has tormented you for years didn't come to stay. It came to be slain. But only if you're bold enough to look it in the eye. And so now, before we talk about how to destroy what's been haunting you, we must first uncover the secret that gave it permission to return again and again. You've probably asked yourself this more than once. Why does this keep happening to me? The faces change, the seasons change, but somehow the feeling remains. That familiar ache in your spirit. The same disappointments, playing on a loop, the emotional collapse right after spiritual momentum, that sudden return of anxiety just when you started to feel peace, the silent storm that doesn't announce itself but always finds a way back in. It feels like a curse, it feels like punishment, but it's neither. It's an assignment. Chosen one, I need you to understand this at a soul-deep level. Repeated warfare in your life is not a sign that you're broken, it's a sign that you've been noticed. You carry a spiritual imprint that heaven authored before your body ever formed. And the moment your soul took on flesh, the spirit realm responded. The angels rejoiced, but so did the adversary take notice. Hell doesn't waste its energy chasing people with no spiritual consequence. The enemy doesn't bother those who are content to live distracted, detached, and spiritually dormant. He saves his most targeted attacks for those who carry divine blueprints, those born with a call to disrupt darkness, to heal bloodlines, to break generational chains with nothing but their presence and obedience. The repetition you're experiencing is not because God has forgotten you, it's because the enemy has recognized you. Your name carries a frequency in the spirit. Your prayers carry weight. Your discernment can detect atmospheres most people ignore. That's why you've always felt different. That's why you've battled silence in rooms full of people. That's why you've felt watched even in stillness. You weren't imagining it. You were marked, and the warfare followed that mark. The patterns in your life are not accidental. They are engineered, designed to distract, crafted to delay, positioned to wear you down not through dramatic battles but through familiar loops. Loops that convince you you're not progressing. Loops that make you question your own deliverance. Loops that wear the mask of your own thoughts. Maybe this is just who I am. Maybe I'll never change. Maybe God isn't coming through after all. But hear me clearly, this is not your identity. It's your assignment. You weren't called to accommodate this cycle. You were called to break it. Sometimes we expect our calling to feel like fire from heaven, loud, glorious, unmistakable. But often, our greatest assignments are disguised in the things that wound us the most. Your rejection has purpose. Your repeated heartbreak carries revelation. The very places where the enemy keeps attacking are the very areas God intends to use you with the greatest authority. Think back. Even as a child, there were signs. The spiritual sensitivity that no one could explain. The loneliness that never made sense. The dreams that felt too real to be imagination. You've been walking in the shadow of this assignment for years, even before you had language for it. And the repetition you face now is not a malfunction, it's a divine signal, a call to attention. The enemy's goal was never just to torment you. It was to train you into forgetting who you are. Because the moment you awaken to your identity, the moment you remember what heaven wrote about you, his strategy collapses. And that's exactly what this moment is. An awakening, a reminder, a holy confrontation between your spirit and the lies you've inherited from repeated patterns. Some of these patterns, yes, began with your own choices, but many of them were born long before you. They were passed down through wounded generations. You're not just fighting for peace in your own life. You're fighting to rewrite the narrative of a family line that's been crying out for liberation. The patterns of addiction, the fear of intimacy, the cycles of poverty, shame, or failure. You didn't create them, but you were chosen to end them. That's why it's felt so heavy. That's why the emotional pressure doesn't match the physical situation. Because you're carrying something spiritual, something ancient, something that's waited generations for someone with enough discernment to see the pattern and enough spiritual fire to confront it. And chosen one, you are that someone. What you're experiencing isn't random. It's a war over your voice, your anointing, your capacity to shift the lives of others. The repetition isn't a glitch, it's your training ground. Heaven has allowed this assignment not to break you, but to reveal what was always inside of you, to show you that you weren't just meant to survive spiritual warfare. You were built to rule through it. Most people imagine demons as grotesque, terrifying figures, shadows that scream, faces that haunt, nightmares that come alive. But chosen one, the most dangerous demons rarely look like monsters. They don't approach with fear. They slip in wrapped in comfort. They mimic familiarity. They look like what you've already accepted. They dress in the language of your past and speak in the tone of your inner voice. You don't rebuke them because you don't recognize them. And what you can't recognize, you won't resist. The truth is, some of the strongest enemies of your soul aren't lurking in the corners of your room, they're embedded in the patterns you've normalized. That lingering insecurity you've labeled as just who I am, that toxic relationship you keep justifying because they mean well, that chronic fear you call wisdom. These are not just emotions or tendencies. Many of them are spiritual strategies, calculated deceptions sent to silence your authority and seduce you into spiritual sleep. The Apostle Paul warned us clearly in 2 Corinthians 11:14 when he said, "And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light." The enemy doesn't always oppose you violently. Sometimes he agrees with you just enough to gain your trust. If he can get you to call dysfunction personality or call trauma discernment, he doesn't need to attack you head-on. He simply settles in and watches you manage your own bondage. He doesn't steal your power. He waits for you to hand it over in exchange for false peace. You've likely prayed for a breakthrough, cried for deliverance, fasted, and asked God why nothing seems to change. And yet the same heaviness returns. The same relationships crumble. The same temptations resurface. It's not because your faith is weak. It's because the enemy has built something within you that feels too familiar to question. You've been rebuking symptoms without confronting the stronghold. You've been fighting the fruit, not the root. This is where discernment becomes your most dangerous weapon. Because not every spirit comes to frighten you, some come to flatter you. They convince you to stay where it's safe, where it's predictable, where you don't have to confront the pain or revisit the memories. But God is calling you deeper. And to go deeper, you have to be willing to ask hard questions. What have I been managing that I was called to cast out? What have I been calling normal that God has always called demonic? Those dreams that keep returning, the same hallway, the same person, the same weight in your chest, those aren't just random flickers of your imagination. They are signals. The spirit realm is speaking. Your soul is trying to reveal the place where something entered. God is not just trying to encourage you, He's trying to awaken you. Because the demon hiding behind your comfort is the very thing assigned to destroy your calling. The real danger is this. Demons don't need to roar when they've learned to whisper, and they don't need to fight you when they've been allowed to sit at your table. They blend into the background of your habits, your coping mechanisms, your culture, even your theology. And as long as they can go unnamed, they can go unchallenged. Jesus said in John 8:32, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." But truth doesn't work until it becomes personal. Deliverance begins not when you cry, but when you see clearly and declare, "This doesn't belong here anymore." Chosen one, you were never meant to live under false peace. You were never meant to manage darkness just because it came dressed as survival. Your spirit was built for discernment, not denial. This is not a battle of volume, it's a battle of clarity. The moment you identify the voice that's been echoing in your mind, the moment you expose the lie that's been shaping your decisions, the grip begins to break. This is your call to name what's been hidden, not to shame yourself, but to reclaim your authority. You cannot kill what you're still calling home, and you cannot close a door you refuse to admit is open. But now that your eyes are opening, there's a deeper question that must be asked. If this thing has stayed hidden for so long, how did it get in? Because no spirit has access without a doorway. And if you want to drive it out, you must first return to the place where the door was opened. Before you can cast something out, you must understand how it got in. No spirit takes up residence in your life without a legal doorway. Demons don't kick down locked gates, they wait for cracks in the soul. And often, those cracks were made long before you were old enough to understand them. For many chosen ones, the first entry point came in childhood. Before you had words for what you felt, before you knew how to guard your heart, something got in through pain, through silence, through fear. Maybe it was neglect, maybe it was abuse, maybe it was growing up in an atmosphere where love felt conditional and safety was never promised. You were spiritual even then. You felt things you couldn't explain. You saw things others ignored. You cried over wounds no one could name. And the enemy saw it too. That sensitivity wasn't a weakness. It was your gifting in raw form. So hell came early, hoping to twist what heaven intended to refine. C.S. Lewis once wrote in The Problem of Pain, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." The enemy knows this as well. Pain is a gateway, and where God intends to awaken, the enemy intends to infiltrate. That wound you didn't choose, that memory you've tried to forget, it became an opening. Not because you're guilty, but because the pain was never healed, and what remains unhealed becomes spiritually exposed. And then there are the doors we opened ourselves, seasons of rebellion, curiosity without covering, times when you stepped into things you didn't understand, tarot cards, energy work, crystals, horoscopes, seeking meaning but entering territory you weren't spiritually equipped to navigate. Not everything mystical is spiritual, and not everything spiritual is holy. When we cross into realms outside of God's protection, we give the enemy permission to leave a signature, and signatures give legal rights. Some of the open doors were people. soul ties formed in moments of vulnerability, physical or emotional intimacy with someone who was carrying demons you never saw. They didn't just leave a memory, they left an imprint. That's why, after some relationships, you didn't just feel heartbreak, you felt haunted. You lost pieces of your peace, of your sleep, of your spiritual clarity. You stopped feeling like yourself, because someone else's bondage became entangled with your identity. Until that tie is broken, the door remains open. The demon doesn't need your phone number anymore, it knows where you sleep. And then there's the inheritance. The spiritual DNA passed down through generations: fear, addiction, poverty, rage, lust, confusion, not just behaviors, strongholds, things you were born into, battles you didn't ask for. You're not just fighting for your life, you're fighting for your lineage. That's why the pressure has felt unbearable at times. Because what you're facing isn't new, it's ancient, but so are you. Your spirit agreed to this assignment before you ever drew breath. Somewhere in eternity, you said yes. And that yes gave you authority. The last kind of doorway is often the hardest to admit, the one we unlocked through disobedience. You knew the truth. You walked the other way. You heard the warning. You ignored it. You felt the check in your spirit and overrode it with pride or emotion. And while God is merciful, the spirit realm is legal. Demons don't operate on grace, they operate on access. They don't leave just because you regret it. They leave when the contract is broken. But here's the good news. What entered through pain can be healed through presence. What was opened through sin can be closed through surrender. What came through inheritance can be overturned through divine authority. The same way the enemy got in is the same path through which God will drive him out. Because the power is not in pretending the door was never there, it's in standing before it and slamming it shut with the weight of your awakening. Now that you've seen the door, you have a choice. Keep it cracked with compromise, or seal it shut with spiritual authority. But to do that, you must be equipped with the right weapons. Because what entered spiritually can only be cast out spiritually. You may have thought God was ignoring you. He saw your tears but chose not to answer. He heard your prayers but remained silent. You've cried, "How many times must I go through this? Why does the same battle return just when I start to feel free?" But chosen one, what if I told you He allowed it on purpose? Not to punish you, but to prepare you. God is not indifferent to your suffering. He's not a distant observer watching you spiral. He's a father, a refiner, a strategist, and He knows what pressure must be applied to awaken the authority inside you. The cycles weren't sent to destroy you. They were designed to expose what you were still submitting to, what you were still tolerating, what you were still afraid to face. You thought it was just life repeating itself, but spiritually, it was a battlefield. And each return of the pattern was another opportunity for you to recognize the assignment, reclaim your identity, and rise in maturity. You see, heaven never wastes pain. Every tear was a conversation, every breakdown was a revelation waiting to be received. But when your mindset remains focused on escape instead of understanding, you miss the lesson within the loop. And the loop continues, not because God is absent, but because He's trying to build something eternal in you. This is not about endurance for the sake of suffering. It's about transformation through resistance. God could have delivered you in an instant, yes, but He chose to deliver you through the fire so you'd learn how to carry the flame. Deliverance without maturity is wasted authority. And heaven doesn't promote the unprepared. You weren't just being attacked, you were being trained. Every time the same temptation returned, every time the emotional wound reopened, every time you felt abandoned or overwhelmed, God was not trying to break you, He was trying to forge you. The repetition wasn't the problem, it was the proving ground. The cycle was meant to test your sight, your surrender, your spiritual muscle. Could you discern the difference between healing and avoidance? Could you stand in obedience, even when the enemy used the same tactic again and again? Could you remain faithful when nothing felt different, but everything in the unseen was shifting? Many of the greatest warriors in Scripture had to walk through their own repetitions. Joseph didn't just go from pit to palace, he endured cycles of betrayal, misunderstanding, and delay. David was anointed long before he was appointed, and the wilderness wasn't an interruption, it was his classroom. Even Jesus, led by the Spirit into the wilderness, faced temptation in 3 waves. Why? Because what is repeated is revealed, and what is revealed can finally be defeated. You've asked God to remove the storm, but the truth is, He sent it to reveal what still had power over you. The cycle allowed you to see yourself honestly, not the version others admire. Not the image you've projected, but the raw version of your spirit, the one who still wrestles with fear, doubt, self-rejection, pride, or hidden pain. And that version is the one He's after. Not to shame you, but to shape you, because what He's building in you cannot be shaken. What He's planting in you cannot be stolen, but it had to be tested. So if the battle keeps returning, it's not because you're weak, it's because God is refining you. You are being tempered like steel, and chosen one, steel forged in the fire, does not break in the storm. It becomes a weapon. That's why the cycle was permitted. Because when you rise from it, not just healed but aware, not just encouraged but empowered, you don't just survive, you carry a mantle. You move differently. You speak with authority. You walk with clarity. You no longer fear the shadows because you've been through the dark and remembered your light. But spiritual clarity means nothing if you don't know how to fight. You've seen the pattern. You've identified the door. You understand the reason. Now it's time to pick up your weapons and learn how to strike. You've seen the pattern. You've felt the repetition. You've cried for answers and begged for deliverance. But chosen one, what if I told you that what you've been pleading for has already been placed inside of you? What if the breakthrough you're waiting on isn't waiting at all? It's simply waiting for you to remember the weapon you've been carrying all along. You don't need a new word. You don't need another sign. You don't need someone to lay hands on you. What you need is to awaken to the arsenal that heaven already placed within you. Because the truth is, hell hasn't been fighting you over your weakness, it's been fighting you over your weapons. And the first weapon the enemy always tries to silence is your voice, not your personality, not your opinions. Your spirit-led voice, the one that carries weight in the unseen realm, the one that can shift atmospheres, bind spirits, command peace, and release heaven's will into the earth. That voice is not ordinary. It was never meant to blend in. When you speak under divine alignment, the realm of darkness listens, and it trembles. But somewhere along the way, the enemy convinced you that your voice didn't matter. He used shame to mute it. He used insecurity to shrink it. He used failure to discredit it. He made you feel like silence was safer. But the longer you remained quiet, the more power he retained. Because silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is spiritual, surrender to the wrong kingdom. You don't need to be loud to be lethal, but you do need to be clear. Scripture says, death and life are in the power of the tongue. Proverbs 18:21. That means your declarations matter. That means when you speak the word, when you reject lies, when you declare the promises of God, you are not just being spiritual, you are going to war, and demons do not fear your volume. They fear your alignment. The second weapon is obedience. And though it rarely feels glamorous, it is the most direct strike against demonic territory. Every time you obey God in the dark, every time you say yes when it costs you your comfort, every time you refuse the easy path in favor of the righteous one, you take ground in the Spirit. Obedience isn't passive, it's warfare in disguise. The enemy cannot forecast it, he cannot duplicate it, and he cannot withstand it. That's why he's been trying to make you hesitate. That's why compromise has crept in subtly. That's why every instruction from God has felt unusually hard lately. Because your yes has power, and every delay weakens your sword. The Spirit of God doesn't require your perfection, but He does require your movement. Because partial obedience is still disobedience, and delayed obedience opens the door to spiritual resistance. Your third forgotten weapon is discipline. The steady, quiet rhythm of consecration. The kind no one claps for. The kind that builds you in silence. Prayer when you're tired. Fasting when you're overlooked. Worship when you're wounded. Study when you feel dry. These are the weapons that sharpen your edge, and the enemy knows it. That's why he's been attacking your focus. That's why distraction suddenly feels like a spiritual flood. Because discipline develops authority, and authority terrifies darkness. Maybe you haven't realized it, but every time you prayed and no one saw, every time you worshipped and felt nothing, every time you obeyed, even when it didn't make sense, you were building a spiritual frequency that the enemy couldn't copy and couldn't stop. These weapons, your voice, your obedience, your discipline, they are not ornaments. They are instruments of war. You don't need another tool. You just need to remember what's already been given. The same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead dwells in you. That means every time you align your words with heaven, demons lose ground. Every time you move in obedience, strongholds begin to fracture. Every time you press past your emotions and enter into disciplined devotion, you reinforce heaven's government within your life. So stop waiting for a miracle to fall from the sky. Pick up your sword. Reignite your prayer life. Speak what God says even when it contradicts what you feel. Rebuke the lie. Break the soul tie. Fast until clarity returns. Worship until heaviness lifts. Declare until your atmosphere changes. Because, chosen one, you're not unequipped. You're just waking up. And now, chosen one, now that your weapons have been sharpened, your identity awakened, and your atmosphere reclaimed, something inside you has shifted. You can feel it, can't you? A clarity that wasn't there before. A stillness beneath the noise. A fire that no longer flickers in fear, but burns with conviction. This is not just the end of a battle. It's the beginning of your dominion. Because you were never called to merely survive spiritual warfare. You were called to govern it. The demon was loud, but your obedience was louder. The cycle was persistent, but your surrender broke the pattern. The enemy fought hard, but heaven fought harder. And now you understand. The repetition wasn't punishment, it was refinement. God was not ignoring you, He was initiating you, training you, teaching you how to move with weight in the spirit realm, how to discern between shadows and truth, and how to walk into a room knowing that what once overwhelmed you must now obey you. C.S. Lewis once wrote in Mere Christianity, "Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps, you can understand what He is doing, but presently He starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts. You thought you were going to be made into a decent little cottage, but He is building a palace. He intends to come and live in it Himself." This is what the fire was really about. Not destruction, but construction. God was not simply trying to clean up your life. He was building something holy inside of it. Every repeated storm was knocking down a wall that didn't belong. Every cycle that returned was another hammer blow reshaping your spiritual foundation. And now, the palace is ready. You didn't just survive, you were shaped. You didn't just fight, you were forged. You didn't just pray, you were positioned. The demons that once terrified you now recognize your spiritual rank. The patterns that held your bloodline hostage for generations now shatter beneath your command. You are not just someone who got free, you are someone who can set others free. This is your legacy now. Not fear, not trauma, not silence, but rulership born not of pride but of purpose. You walk in the echo of generations who came before you. But unlike them, you are the one who remembered. You remembered who you are. You remembered what you carry. You remembered that being chosen was never about being perfect. It was about being available. So, take a moment now. Breathe it in. The fire didn't consume you. It crowned you. You don't owe this world silence. You owe it clarity. You owe it testimony. You owe it the full presence of a soul who knows who they are in Christ and walks like it. If this word pierced your spirit, drop "I remember who I am" in the comments. Let every demon watching know the chosen one did not break, they rose. And now that you've been restored, refined, and revealed, go rule what once ruled over you, because the throne has always been yours.